We bring you greetings on behalf of the administration, Board of Trustees, faculty, and staff of the King's College. We are very pleased to be the host for this important conversation tonight on the question of should Christians rethink the role of free markets. We have two very distinguished speakers and panelists here with us tonight, and I think it goes without saying that one of the reasons that prompted this debate and this conversation, one of the reasons that we are here tonight is that a few weeks ago, our colleague Rusty Reno, editor of First Things, wrote an article in First Things revisiting Michael Novak's 1982 classic, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. If I might borrow a biblical analogy from Acts 17, some mocked. Others said he seems to be preaching strange deities. And others said, we would like to hear you again on this matter. I thought it wise to bring another important voice in this conversation to bear in this respect, Father Robert Sirico from the Acton Institute. We're very pleased to host this debate, and I want to give you a sense of how the evening will unfold, the format, and then I will make introductions of our speakers and read the formal debate prompt for this evening that has been agreed upon by both of our speakers. We will begin with an opening statement from Rusty. We will have a following opening statement from Father Sirico. Both will have opportunities to give a response, first Rusty, then Father. And then I will begin our time of questions and answers as the moderator with a few opening salvos, after which I thought it was very important for us to take questions from the floor. Some of you have traveled a long way. We have high school students that drove from South Jersey in the rain for this event tonight. We have people from Palm Beach and from Louisiana who have flown in for this debate, and you want to ask questions. So we will have a runner, we will have a mic, I will open it up for questions, but hear me on this. I will not, as the moderator, allow any stump speeches from the floor. When you ask a question, it must be in the form of a question, all right? Make it pithy, poignant, and hopefully trenchant. Our panelists will be the judge of that. If you yammer on, I will shut you down and I will say boo until you stop, okay? So just don't do it. Ask a question. At the end of questions from the floor, in which we will all behave ourselves, we will have a time for 5 minutes of reflections at the end, both from Rusty and from Father Sirico. So, let me begin with the brief introductions of our panelists tonight, and then we will turn it over to Rusty Reno. Rusty Reno, as you know, is the editor of First Things. He's formerly a professor of theology and ethics at Creighton University. His most recent book is Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society. His writings have challenged us all, including another much discussed article in the New York Times. He holds the PhD from the Department of Religious Studies from Yale University. And I think it is safe to say that he is one of the thinkers at the forefront of Christian and cultural intellectual engagement today. Welcome, Rusty, to our evening tonight here at the King's College. Father, thank you. Father Robert Sirico is known to many of you as the founder of the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a mission that began precisely because religious studies students did not seem to understand fundamental economic principles, which left them poorly equipped to understand and address today's social problems. I think I can speak on behalf of the faculty and staff and students of the King's College that we have all greatly benefited from the ministry of Father Sirico and the Acton Institute and the many worthies that surround him. He has a very distinguished career, but I think it is perhaps best for me to say in this brief introduction that what is often not said of Father Sirico is that he is a parish priest at Sacred Heart in Grand Rapids. He is a pastor. And so would you please join me in welcoming tonight Father Robert Sirico to the King's College. With that, I will read the debate prompt and we will be off to the races. Here's the prompt. Can free markets promote human flourishing? Rusty Reno.
Thank you, Greg Thornbury, and King's College for sponsoring this evening's event. It's a real pleasure to be able to take the podium with Father Sirico. I really admire the work that he's done at the Acton Institute and the labors he has undertaken on behalf of liberty, very important endeavors over the last few decades. But to this question, can free markets promote human flourishing? Free markets have done a great deal to promote human flourishing, and they continue to do so. But markets are human, and like all things human in our fallen world, free markets can also impede human flourishing. This is especially true today. We live in a time of dramatic change. Many forces are at work in 2017, and these forces pose threats to human flourishing. Our political freedom depends upon a strong democratic culture. This is being threatened by the rise of a globalized oligarchy, a network of corporate managers, NGO leaders, government officials, and the vast army of technocrats that keep things humming. Deregulation, lower taxes, and other policies that promote economic freedom may be good for all sorts of reasons, but they will do nothing to stymie this oligarchy. On the contrary, this oligarchy often champions the free flow of goods, capital, and labor throughout the world. The economic freedom championed by this rising oligarchy contributes to the disillusion of our once thriving and confident middle class. And it's this confident middle class that is the only limit, potentially, on their power. It seems to me that we need to join together to resist this global oligarchy, and that's going to require rebuilding our middle class. And this is going to require political action. It's not going to happen automatically. We need policies that favor small and mid-sized companies that are necessary to sustain democratic capitalism. To limit the power of the oligarchy, we should consider progressive corporate taxes that combat economic giganticism. These taxes should rise as corporate revenue reaches supersized proportions. We also need to regulate global trade deals and renegotiate global trade deals and rethink regulations so that local companies connected with their communities have competitive advantages over and against gigantic global corporations. Over the last 2 generations, we've erected a meritocratic system dedicated to upward mobility and economic freedom. And it has achieved many good things. But in 2017, this meritocratic mentality creates a sense of entitlement and a corresponding disdain for ordinary people that are not members of that charmed circle. They are derided as takers or as deplorables. This contributes to an erosion of solidarity, which is a far greater threat to the Republic than present limits on free markets. In order to arrest the erosion of solidarity, we should tax the supersized endowments of elite universities. The bill before Congress currently presupposes to do exactly that, and we should support this element. Now, spiritual freedom is the most important freedom of all. As St. Paul puts it, for freedom Christ has made us free. Bonded to Christ in faith, no worldly power can compel our souls. This spiritual freedom has a natural form, and not just a supernatural form. People are free when they give themselves in loyalty to something greater than themselves. As the patriots in New Hampshire said during the Revolutionary War, live free or die. Today, we suffer from a profound erosion of natural loves. We are atomized and rootless. We lack community, and many among us neither have a father at home nor a father in heaven. The resulting individualism promises freedom, but that promise is false. Today, we are in bondage to worldly powers. Even the most successful among us worry compulsively about our careers. Others are enslaved to addictions, and still others sleepwalk through life and following the dictates of advertising and mass culture. And I'm here to tell you today that promoting economic freedom will do nothing to reverse this bondage. In fact, it can deceive us into believing that greater economic efficiency and wealth creation will solve the deep cultural and spiritual problems facing our society. The Wall Street Journal editorial page gives the impression that there are no problems that economic growth won't solve. Again, we need to take political action here. If unrestrained, free markets colonize every aspect of life. The 24/7 marketing of our private lives by Facebook and Google is but one example. We need to restore Sabbath laws and limit commerce in other ways. We need to tax internet commerce at a much higher rate in order to protect the face-to-face community of a healthy local economy. Economic freedom plays a crucial role in fostering a free society. I'm here to endorse that premise. Of course, economic freedom plays a crucial role in fostering a healthy and free society. But it is not the only factor. And today, an undue focus on economic freedom can distract us from the need to foster the other elements of a free society. And those elements are solidarity between the leaders and the led, a wide and confident middle class, as well as shared loves that rouse our hearts. There's no principle by which we can answer the question about free markets and human flourishing. Markets are human inventions, and like all human institutions in our fallen world, the results are necessarily mixed. In order to think morally about markets, we need to think realistically and not ideologically. So I want to end with an exhortation. Let us not fail to see the forest for the trees. Yes, of course there's a great deal of burdensome regulation and unnecessary bureaucracy in today's economy. And we should do our best to try to minimize that and eliminate it when we can. But those are the trees in our present social situation, our present political situation. The forest is this. We are living in an era of unprecedented economic freedom. Capital moves freely and rapidly, more rapidly than at any point in human history. Today's expansive protections of intellectual property allows corporations to shop for low tax locations throughout the world. This unprecedented economic freedom is vastly more important than the limits imposed today by financial regulations. Let's work to get rid of bad regulations by all means. And let's work to get rid of harmful limitations to economic freedom. But it is foolish and counterproductive and increasingly irresponsible to imagine that in 2017 doing so is our greatest political imperative. Our crisis is one of solidarity, national sovereignty, and spiritual confidence. If we are to be responsible citizens, I would submit to you this evening, we need to think about economic freedom in light of these greater challenges. Thank you.
I want to thank you, King's College, for this wonderful invitation and the opportunity to exchange some ideas with Rusty and all of you tonight. 30 minutes on the D train would bring you to where I grew up in East Flatbush, more years ago than I'd like to admit. And in that whole journey of those 66 years between growing up in Brooklyn and where I am now, I've seen a lot of different things and advocated a lot of different causes, some of which I'm still doing penance for. And come to you tonight as Greg mentioned, a pastor. I'm a pastor. That's my fundamental identity other than being a Christian, of course. And I want to tell you a little bit about my parish because I think what I've learned in my parish is instructive for what we're going to discuss tonight. I was assigned to this particular parish, Sacred Heart of Jesus, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, not Detroit, not Flint, Grand Rapids, Michigan, 6 years ago, and I found a moribund parish. It had a long history. It was, the church building itself was built in 1924. The school was established in 1904 by Polish immigrants, for the most part, who worked in the gypsum mines just above where our neighborhood is there. And these were hardworking people. We have records of their donations of 10 cents and 25 cents that went in to the building of this magnificent church, which is built on a kind of model of St. John's outside the walls in Rome. To think that these hardworking people were able to pull that off at that time, remember this is just a few years before the crash, is an amazing thing, and they left a great legacy. But by the time I arrived some 6 years ago, a lot of that legacy had passed. The neighborhood had changed a great deal, a lot of economic changes, and the parish I inherited had a school where I found 68 kids in a quasi-Catholic school. I say it was a Catholic school because it's associated with the diocese. But if you went to the dance that I went to for the 7th graders, it was very odd. They had this kind of, this crystal ball floating in the ceiling, and the girls were on one side of the gym and the boys were on the other. It's just out of a movie, and the girls wearing slinky little dresses and this music blaring and these boys awkwardly not knowing what to do. And I said, this is how we want to teach these kids how to interact with one another, a nightclub setting. And then the church itself. I joked with some of the older Polish ladies there. I said, there's that pew that you have been sitting in for the better part of my lifetime has your DNA in it. You haven't moved from that pew. And it became very insular. Everybody kind of looking inward, very protective of their space, protective of their positions, which were eroding from underneath them because as the parish grew older, the committees weren't functioning anymore. The liturgy was dead. It just sucked the energy out of you trying to preach in this environment. I said, we have to do something in this place, this little part of an otherwise astoundingly vibrant city. Grand Rapids, as I said, is not Flint, it's not Detroit. It's an entrepreneurial city, especially so in the last 40 or 50 years or so due to a lot of different factors. It's one of the highest per capita philanthropic giving cities in the country. Salt Lake City is ahead of us, but we know why that's the case. And this wonderful mix of Christian Reform people, evangelicals and Roman Catholics in this city. I remember when we began to refound the school, it was refounded as a school with a clear identity. We bought uniforms. And I said, we're going to go to Mass every day. They said, what? Every day. I don't know, we must be one of 10 schools where our kids go to Mass. They begin their school day at Mass every day. Today, let me just kind of tell you that we have 310 students in that school. A lot of homeschooling parents. We've made accommodations for them to come 2 days a week. We have the traditional Mass. Why am I telling you all about this parish in the context of a conversation on free markets and flourishing? I'm saying that what was infecting our parish is what is infecting our nation. And this is not the kind of thing that we could solve by policies coming from government. Our school had three, who were full-time teachers in that school. We had to make an arrangement where we removed all of the religious symbols in the school. I fired them. We had a hot lunch program. The dietitian came to me and said, Father, these kids don't like kale. And I have to go to 2 months' worth of training every year to serve them this regulated food. I said, let's get rid of it. When I did that, they said, well, who's going to feed the kids? And I said, their families. And I'll have peanut butter and jelly in the rectory with tomato soup, which was my favorite lunch down in Brooklyn when I was growing up. All of this began to transform. What I'm saying is, when a mission was projected, when our people saw a clear identity of who they were, when they began to move around in that parish, when they were helped to understand the importance of welcoming people and looking beyond the boundaries of this parish, our parish began to grow. It wasn't subsidies from the government, it wasn't regulations from some school board, it was a sense of community that was formed. These things are not achieved by bureaucracies. These things are not achieved by external apparatuses that manipulate or coerce or threaten people into being better people. These are modeled as one family models what a good and decent life is for another family. As people get together and on social occasions. By the way, our fall dance, which I described to you earlier now, is held at someone's farm in a barn with all of the families, all of the kids, with square dances. And it's really, I hate it when I can't make it to that event each year. The culture was transformed. Our people are entrepreneurial. They are willing to risk. They are willing to risk both on a personal level in terms of their charity that they show to one another. They're willing to risk in the number of jobs and businesses that are being formed and the people who are associating with one another and hiring one another. Even in our school now, our maintenance is done by a maintenance person who hires the kids in the school to work, and it's a formative experience for them. It's not just a matter of cleaning the school, but a matter of rendering worship to God in their acts of cleaning. This is what is missing. And this, in our society, cannot be achieved by no matter how many well thought out and detailed governmental policies or subsidies or penalties in forms of taxation. We have diagnosed the problem. Everybody in this room knows what the problem is. What we need is the solution. The solution is not less liberty. The solution is not less access to being able to enter into circles of exchange with one another. The solution is not more and more restrictions on our success, on our prosperity, on our bank books. It's not more and more regulations that intrude inevitably into our lives. There is a crisis in our country, and it is a crisis of morality, which is predicated on human freedom, human choice, because morality is the free acceptance of virtues and the habitual practice of those virtues that transforms not only ourselves, but begins to transform our neighbors and our communities and our parishes and our city. Grand Rapids is not Flint. Grand Rapids is not Detroit, because Grand Rapids never had the kind of burdensome, stifling regulations and union contracts that made the whole city protectionist, that became a form of those people sitting in that pew and only looking inside and thinking that the solution is from the inside. God has created an incredible variety of human talent and insight and knowledge. To restrict our ability to engage with that knowledge and with those talents, to try and ward it all off and harness it and manage it, is not the solution. It, in fact, is a cure that is worse than the disease itself. What we need are open societies that understand the moral telos of their freedom. We need societies that once again retrieve a sense of moral responsibility, where we are responsible for one another, not because we're penalized if we don't act in responsible ways, but because we are interiorly motivated and converted to do that. To waste so much time, as so many of our religious leadership does, hectoring about policies and campaigns and political nuances here and there, all of which may be appropriate in certain circumstances, is to disregard the genius that is right before us. Set a vision, offer a moral alternative, and you will have an army of people that will go to the barricades to create a free and a virtuous society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father. That's for those remarks. I certainly agree that the transformation of the heart is crucial for any significant social change. But I want to return to the story that you told about the school, which I think is a very powerful story. It seems in that story, it was policies coming from the pastor that was very crucial to sweep away a broken system. The authority of the pastor, his role, appropriate role, as authority over the community was crucial. And I think this is an important lesson. Action has to be taken in order to sweep away a broken system. And I think Father Sirico and I agree that there are many aspects of American society today that are broken and need to be swept away. Political action is one of the crucial ways in which civil society comes together to do something. That's the way that, it's not the only way, but it is a crucial way that we come together to do something. We kick the bums out. Teachers' unions are not going to be broken by spontaneous civic action. They're going to be broken when we elect public officials who change the laws for union organization. That's how it's going to change. And government action is the standard way in which a free society of self-governing people take political action. So a government is an instrument of our will. Now, we know, sadly, that it rarely is an instrument of our will. But that is a call for us to engage in political life with a determination to take possession of the instruments of government in order to promote the common good, and not to allow it to be commandeered by rent seekers and monopolists, lobbyists, and special corporate interests. A good example, it seems to me, is the government school monopoly. I don't like to call them public schools, I like to call them government schools. The government school monopoly on tax revenue. I think that needs to be broken, that monopoly. And just like it took government action to break up Standard Oil's monopoly on the oil industry in 1910, it's going to take government action to break the government school monopoly on tax revenue. And the way to do it, and we've tried to do it in New York and failed, the way to do it is to establish a tax credit scheme for scholarship programs for kids that go to private schools. It's a simple idea. It's going to promote the growth of civil society because every scholarship program is going to have to form its own 501c3. It's going to have its own board of directors. It's going to have to receive applications for scholarship funding. It's going to have to raise funds. And this is an example of where we can take political action in order to clear space for the rebirth of civil society. So I don't think that Father Sirico and I disagree about the disease, nor do I think we disagree about the health that we seek. I think where we disagree is in his pessimism about the possibility that we can use government in order to achieve positive ends. And I am guardedly pessimistic about the role of government in civic life. It is often a dead hand, but it's not, that the dead hand of government is not going to be loosened unless we take political action. And as I said in my remarks, I regard the greatest threat to our freedom to be a rising oligarchy that is economic and cultural. And we're only going to break its grip on the future of our society if we attack the sources of their power. And that's going to require us to gather together politically and take action, just as it took action in earlier generations in order to fend off any number of different evils. So, thank you.
For a man who's guardedly pessimistic about government regulation, you sure have a lot of suggestions on how we can increase government. I think the fundamental, if you listen to the litany, the plethora of programs of taxing and regulation and various kinds of ideas to correct this problem, what you have is some enormous bureaucracy that's got to be managed by somebody. And I've got news for you. Rusty, you're not going to be on the committee when that day comes. It's just not going to happen. People like us don't get on those committees. And let me give you two conceptual ways of thinking about this. The first comes from Robert Nesbitt, who makes a distinction between authority and power. Rusty says that we need authority, and that in my parish there was authority, there was authority. And there was action, but it was authority. I just preached on this last Sunday, as a matter of fact. The difference between authority and power, according to Nesbitt, is that while they are both forms of constraint, power is a form of constraint that is exterior to the person. You are forced to do it. It's the police force, basically, the government. Power is that. Authority is an interior form of authority, an interior thing that inspires someone to restrict, to restrain their behavior. It is the authority of your wife who tells you that you're not going golfing Saturday morning because we've got my daughter's wedding, or my sister's wedding to go to. And you don't want to do it, and I don't know about your domestic situation, but in most homes, she's not going to grab a frying pan. It's merely her authority and the covenant of that marriage. So this difference, yes to action, yes to authority, no to government's intrusion on our lives in this way. You can. It's easy to create these programs. It's a whole other thing to pull them out. And that's the second conceptual point that I want to remind us of, and I suspect we all know this very well, and that's called the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity says is all of this action needs to go on, and it needs to begin not with public policies, not with government intrusion, not with subsidies or penalties, but right on the local level. So if you want a policy, the policy is remove all of this government bureaucracy. In other words, why talk about taxing the endowment of Harvard University? Just let's talk about stop subsidizing Harvard University. That's where a lot of their endowment comes from, a lot of the power behind that. Remove the favorable regulations, the subsidies, the indirect licensing things that force these kinds of real monopolies from existing. If there's an erosion of solidarity in our society, which I agree there is, the solution is not having more bureaucracy. It's having real solidarity. It's enabling people, clearing the ground for people to act as brothers and sisters, as neighbors to those who are in need. The principle of subsidiarity allows for government intervention when there is an urgent need, but then only temporarily. The assumption of the principle of subsidiarity is that natural society functions, and that only in moments of the need for a subsidium, a help, that's where the word comes from. It comes from this cache of equipment and food and stuff that were sent with Roman legions and was only allowed to be opened if the supply lines were cut off. And then you used just as much of it as you needed and then closed it up once the supply lines came in again. Bureaucracy doesn't work that way. If you listened very carefully to what Rusty said just now, the whole assumption is that the normative and dominant way in which we affect our society is through these various policies. And let me just address one question that comes up again and again in various of the writings that I've read, both of Rusty and in the recent years of First Things. And that is, they're responding to an assertion that no one is making. Who in the world is saying that the free market is the only factor that affects society, or that it's going to cure all of these? I don't even think the Wall Street Journal editorial page believes that the free market is going to do it all, that all you need to do is have a free economy and everything's going to be fine. I don't even think, it's just not an assertion that I'm making. It's the reason we founded the Acton Institute in 1990, was to bring together the notion of a free society and a virtuous one. But you don't achieve virtue, you don't achieve solidarity by coercing people. People don't become fraternal to one another because there is a policy on the book. The solution comes not from the capitals of politicians. It comes from the reign of Christ in the human heart. And when that happens, there's no amount of regulation that could even anticipate the change that can occur in our local communities, in our cities, and in our nation, in our world. So I'm offering a different vision. We agree on many things, many probably things much more important than what we're discussing tonight. But if we don't have a free society, if we don't have secure property rights, if we don't have the rule of law in terms of the kinds of contracts that people can create, then we are dead in the water. And there's a lot more that I want to say, but I'll get my digs in. I'm from Brooklyn. All
right, I didn't call it Rumble in the Concrete Jungle for nothing. Okay. I want to take a point of personal privilege now just to ask a couple of questions that have sort of been burning for me as someone who's running a Christian liberal arts college in New York, where I think it's safe to say a lot of our students are going back and asking some of these fundamental questions. And I do want to thank you, Rusty, for generating some heat around this discussion, so I hope we can move on to light. No, I said, and we're going to move into light. But I want to make sure. So my first question, and it's straight up the middle, New York Giants football. We had a debate prompt that related to free markets. So I want to know how both of you, and this should be a fairly straightforward answer, how do you define free markets? And do you think that freer markets are better for the majority of people?
Well, free market is one with minimal government interference with private contract and maximal protection of private property, seems to me. And it seems obvious to me that in some circumstances a freer market promotes the common good, and in some instances it doesn't. And it's a matter of political wisdom to know which. In the 19th century, when English society had a static economic system, and economic privilege and class privilege were closely intertwined, creating a freer economy was really integral to the formation of liberal democracy. Today, the very rigorous protection of intellectual property rights allows Apple to offshore its profits to, as we read in the New York Times today, the Jersey Island. And this strikes me as contrary to the common good. So it depends. We're not living in 1845, we're living in 2017. And so our goal, free markets are an instrument. They're an intrinsic good in many respects, but they're not the ultimate good. And I think political leaders, and we as democratic citizens share in that leadership, need to make prudential judgments about what needs to be, what elements of market freedom are best restricted and what aren't. I don't think we should have market freedom to sell pornography. I don't think we should have market freedom to sell wombs. I don't think we should have market freedom. I don't think we should have market freedom for, as I said in my thing, I think supersized corporations ought to have weights thrown around their neck because these giant global corporations are increasingly answerable to no national entity. And the nation state is the primary form in which we hold each other accountable. We hold the weak hold the powerful accountable through the nation state in a democratic society. And as these corporations become larger and more powerful, they're going to want to have a global government because they want to partner with some regulating entity to maintain efficient and stable markets. And they're going to push for a global government. And that's going to be the end of the democratic era. And I think we should fight against that.
Thank you. Father? Just speak up. You're on.
Oh, okay. Good. This may surprise everyone. I disagree with you when you say that free markets are an intrinsic good. I don't believe that. If that's what you're arguing here, then the discussion is over. Did you all hear that? That was very important.
Start over.
I don't believe, as Rusty just said, that free markets are an intrinsic good. If I believe free markets were an intrinsic good, I would go along with the womb rental, or for that matter, slavery. Those are markets as well. But I'm against that because the nature, you see, my approach to economics is fundamentally not financial or mathematical. It's fundamentally anthropological. It has to do with who human beings are. I'll say something about that later. But I think it's very important. This notion of supersizing, of course, markets are the least, free markets are those arrangements where the fewest barriers exist. And why they are important, they are as threatening as human freedom itself. Human beings do evil things when they are free to do them, both morally evil, but also evil in a way that coerces others. What I am saying is that this kind of mercantilism that is being presented, or nationalism that is being presented, is going to require the same kind of bureaucratic apparatus that we see now. I contest the notion that these oligarchs, these elites, are all in favor of free trade. All I ask you to do is read the trade agreements. Read them. Those are not free markets. They are not. What curtails the abusiveness of markets is competition. And in order to have competition, this is one priest in my diocese, I hope he doesn't watch this, but when our school began to attract all these students, he got up and very euphemistically said, well, you know, the competition, we shouldn't be competing with one another in Catholic schools. And I said, well, let me put it this way. Let's remove the word competition. We're just planning our affairs differently than you're planning your affairs. And whoever else, the families, will come to who meets their needs the best. That's the way. You don't, a little fish can move much quicker than a big onerous one, a big fat one. And that's what puts it. You talk about Google, you remember Yahoo of happy memory? Or AOL. Does anybody have an AOL email address anymore? And if you do, then we know you're 80 or over.
It's a status symbol now.
Oh, yeah, okay, maybe. And there's the thing. So my point is that you're underplaying the role. Of course we need contracts that are enforceable, but this notion that just because something's big, it's evil is a misnomer, I think.
All right, I want to follow up with something that I've been thinking about since reading Rusty's article. Rusty, you openly worry in your article revisiting Novak's Spirit of Democratic Capitalism about this, and you mentioned it tonight, this technocratic plutocracy that is now contrary to the values of the civil society that once gave America its distinctive character. I think both you and Father would say, you say in your article, socialism is bad. I think everyone agrees that crony capitalism is bad. Both of you have criticized that. My question is the problem really capitalism at all, or is it a cultural Marxism that realized it lost the war on economics, took over the economic system and used its Hegelian relativistic motif to take over large corporations, and now they run the table and use a version of capitalism to sort of undermine the whole, nature of free markets and solidarity and civil society. So is the problem really, economics at all, or is it a much deeper ideology that is now control at the level of control of these large corporations that both of you are worried about? Does that make sense? Is that a?
I'm not sure.
I'm just saying
I'm always skeptical when Winston Churchill said that Christianity is like communism, is a good idea that's never been tried. And often when I have debates with people about this, it turns out that capitalism is a good idea that's never been tried. So there's no actual instance of capitalism, and all failures are a failure to actually realize. So it's the old line about actually existing socialism, we know that there are problems with actually existing socialism, but if we sort of really break through, we're gonna finally get there. And so we get the same thing with actually existing capitalism. So I prefer to look at the economic system that we have, which I think is characterized by a high degree of freedom it's characterized by a high degree of freedom, which is why, which is one of the reasons why the results are so disparate at the present. When I've had my friend Robert Miller, how can you say that we have all this regulation, big giant piles, books, fill up whole shelves? Well, if you say that if you go out after 7 o'clock at night, you're going to be summarily executed, that is a profound regulation on your freedom. You lift the regulation, you lift the curfew, and suddenly you have to regulate nightclubs and evening parking, and you have to have all kinds of regulations having to do with the fact that there are all kinds of abuses of freedom that come when you accord people this great freedom. And the same thing is true in our financial industry. I mean, it wasn't until the late 1990s that you could open a bank in more than one state. The Glass-Steagall Act prevented market makers from employing the largest available pool of capital, which was bank depositors' capital. The Cold War radically restricted capital flows throughout the world, and it wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that most countries throughout the world reduced or eliminated controls on the flow of capital from their own citizens to places like New York and London. And so, yes, of course there's lots of regulation, but I guarantee you there's not a single investment banker in New York City who wants to go back to the old system and would say, hey, look, I'll cut all those regulations, but you have to go back to the way things functioned in 1979. I guarantee you that no one would take you up on that offer.
Father?
You know, the notion that all regulation is achieved by government is mistaken. And I go back to the distinction between authority and power. That what we see happening in a market, and I don't think that markets are inherently deleterious to virtuous culture. That's what I would say. They are not inherently deleterious to virtuous culture. I think we regulate behavior and should regulate behavior on the norm according to tradition and mores. The market reflects what people do. Father Newhouse said it very beautifully in his book, Doing Well and Doing Good, which would probably get a bad review in First Things Today. Because when you, I have the quote from Father Newhouse, and you tell me how Mr. Hart, for instance, would review this book if you want me to get it out.
I would never allow him to review that book.
Well,
I cannot be held accountable for David
You might want
Hart's
to regulate him in a few other ways, too.
dyspeptic personality.
I mean,
he does need regulation. You're absolutely right.
I mean, that wealth is inherently evil. I mean, prices are knowledge. When we intervene in prices and human creativity, what we're doing is making ourselves dumber. And that's my point. Now, are there risks to this? There are risks to this. There are great moral risks to this, especially and primarily because we have a culture that is eroded by this cultural Marxism. Because we've let what I am trying to do with our kids in our school, what I'm trying to do with the Acton Institute, is form men and women who are talented, who are confident, who are committed Christians, and who go out and produce good and more competitive businesses, who produce better movies and better novels and better plays and form the culture in ways, not by occupying my time by lobbying politicians to do it for me. That's the role of the church. If there's a cultural failure in our nation now and in our world, it's at the foot the doorstep of the church. We have failed in doing this. It's not markets that have done it. Markets reflect the moral coercion of the moral erosion that exists within our society as a whole.
Can I just?
Sure, absolutely.
I want to reject this cultural Marxism trope. Political correctness is part of a deregulatory regime, and it's a deregulation of culture. It approaches traditional marriage the way that our government approached the trusts and monopolies of the early 20th century. So it had to break up the monopoly in the oil industry and the steel industry and so forth. So you got to go in there and you got to break it up. And what the left wants to do is break up the monopoly that traditional marriage has over marriage. And to do that, of course, you have to, just like we had to use the power of government to break up those monopolies, we got to use the power of government to break up the monopoly of traditional morality to court. And so that's not Marxism, that's a kind of perverted liberalism that's very much part of our progressive tradition. It's been there for 100+ years. And we're afflicted by diseases of our own making. And so I think it's just unhelpful to think of this as somehow a Soviet. It has characteristics like that because, of course, unlike breaking up economic monopolies, this is an attempt to actually break up the proper authority of nature. And so it's going to require a perpetual battle. So it will take on totalitarian characteristics. But it's not coming from Marxism.
I don't know. I'm the moderator, but I think George Soros. Is very happy to use, on the one hand, a capitalist system to build up his power on the one hand, but use the other hand to break down the cultural mores that are in keeping with his sort of.
Well, he wants to liberate
progressivist
people.
And
He wants to liberate people. We're going to liberate them from traditional morality. We're going to liberate them from the reproductive consequences of the sexual act, which is, of course, why you have to have free contraception and free access to abortion. You have to liberate people from the physical, the biological reality that we're created male
But that's
and
Marxism.
female. That's not Marxism. Had nothing to do with that. No, it didn't.
Yes, that's Hegelianism.
The Soviet
Constant
Union was a very morally priggish society. I don't.
No, only until 1924.
It was static. Well, no, it's true. Early on, they were very progressive, but that's one of the problems with socialism is that it's a static.
It's the problem with people wanting to regulate other people's lives in the name of their own version of what morality is. Marriage is not fundamentally a political institution. It's only secondarily so.
So you think the state should not recognize marriages?
I think the state should recognize marriage. Of course I do.
Then
but what I'm saying is
that state
but
interferes with marriage? Why can't I
not
marry
at all.
two people?
Not at all. The state doesn't invent marriage.
Correct.
God invented marriage.
Yes, it recognizes
what the state
it.
does is recognize a contract, a covenant that people have. And rather than taxing divorce people, why don't you just enforce the covenant of marriage? People get up there freely and say, I commit myself for life to this relationship.
Well, I would like
then
to roll
penalize
back
that.
divorce. I would be happy to do that.
Then penalize that, but it seems like
that doesn't seem politically viable at this point.
But that's the thing. It's politics with you. It's always politics that's got to go in and do something.
Well, it's
and
called prudence.
No.
Prudence is to
prudence
propose
is not
a course of action that's actually
prudence is not
possible
fundamentally
to follow
fulfilled
through on.
in politics. Prudence is fulfilled in virtuous and wise action. Part of what may be political, guided under the principle of subsidiarity, which doesn't give the norm or the dominant role to the state.
Well then, okay. I am now going to embark upon a dangerous experiment, which is going to be to take questions from the floor. Remember my directive to you earlier.
And this will be an exercise in power, not authority.
Yes. That's correct. Okay, we have a runner here. We will begin with a question right here on the floor.
Jason Poling, I'm a parish priest in Baltimore, but of the Anglican variety, so may God have mercy. Longtime First Thing subscriber.
Catholic light.
If you say so. So, Dr. Reno, I was struck by your use in your initial comments and later of the hortatory subjunctive. The question, of course, being who is the we who ought to do X, Y, or Z? And if, in fact, one may make a prudential judgment according to the nature of politics as it is exercised, that the we making these things doing these things which we ought to do, is not actually going to be representative of what the people want and or what people ought to want, how does that affect your calculus as to what degree of power ought to be afforded government?
Well, the we is people of goodwill. So that's...
But everybody else votes too.
Pardon?
But the people who are not of goodwill also get to vote and donate and organize.
Pardon?
They get to vote, they get to donate, they get to organize. They get to operate in the political sphere as well.
Yes, I mean, I am loyal to our constitutional system, and so I'm willing to accept, as Father correctly observed, that I accept the authority of our constitutional system, which means that I'm willing to make myself vulnerable to the power of those with whom I disagree. That's the nature, that's the risk of democratic politics. Of course, it means that, that's the risk of democratic politics. It seems to me the other alternative forms are even more risky. I always told my students when I was teaching theology that I wouldn't mind being born in 16th century Spain as long as I was guaranteed that I could be born a cardinal.
Father, do you have anything?
Well, in the risk question, of course, that's why we don't have a democracy in the United States, why we have a republic. It's to check the power of such things. And that's why we have, the division of powers within our constitutional arrangement. I was reading some of the founders in the last week, and it's just amazing how they keep saying over and over again that the Constitution exists not to restrict the people, it's to restrict the government. And here we have a set of policies that want to empower more and more things that need managing. And as you say, I'm just afraid of who's going to do the managing.
All right, we had another question right down here in the front. Yes, sir.
Good evening. I'd like to thank you both, and I'd like to direct.
Could you stand up so your windpipes are flowing?
Sure. So I'd like to direct this question to Father Sirico, coming from Gravesend, Sicilian. So,
I'm Napolitan, so.
Okay. It seems that liberal economics work very well when you have a people that is fundamentally virtuous. But in 2017, when we have 10 times more heroin overdoses than at any time in our history, and so many addicted to pornography that we cannot actually conduct studies where we have controls of people who do not use pornography, do you not think that recommending more economic liberalism is asking for more trouble? Even Burke says that a people that's unvirtuous should not be given full liberalism.
Yeah. That's a good question, and I share the concern that you have. I hear confessions quite a bit, and I know, as any priest in this room knows, the problem, particularly of pornography, but of other things. I have never recommended jail time for anyone. The surgery that needs to be done there is in the heart and in the soul, and I've seen what can happen in that regard. But let me accept what you say as true, that we're living in an unvirtuous society, which makes the challenge of governing and forming a moral society all the more acute. Who do you think is going to be doing the governing? The politicians are not immaculately conceived. And the difference between the politicians and the pornographers is that when the politicians enact the laws and the regulations, they have power. They have coercive power. The pornographers have to compete with one another, and they have to compete with me in the confessional. And if they don't join up with the politicians, that is, if they don't become crony capitalists, then I can handle that. We can handle that. We can have a revival. We've seen that kind of thing happen in society after society. And what concerns me is that we have so many great people who are animated by the gospel, who are now becoming attracted to this kind of managerial capitalism, or this nationalism, or integralism, or theocracy, or the Tradinistas, and they're occupying their time with regulation and political action, rather than this kind of formation, this radical formation that promotes a revival, a renewal in our country. We can do this. We can do this. We've done it before. We built Western civilization, and we can rebuild it.
Rusty?
We live in a regime that accords pornographers extraordinary protection and does not protect innocent life in the womb. It's an abdication of our responsibility as citizens not to try to work politically to change that.
Point of personal privilege, I'm going to recognize Paul Mueller, my colleague, who is professor of economics at the King's College.
Great, thank you both. I have a question for Dr. Reno. I was a little bit surprised at your example of Standard Oil as an example of a monopoly we want to break up. So I wonder if you could explain a little bit more why you think Standard Oil needed to be broken up after it brought the price of oil per barrel from about 47 cents to close to 3 cents by the time it was broken up. And we also saw the size of the company in terms of market share declining over the course of the whole antitrust activity. So we see prices falling over the 30 years it's operating, and we see its market share declining through competition. So I'm curious why you point to it as an example where we should be busting trusts.
Yeah, it's a market should do more than provide cheap goods. If that's the case, then we ought to export all of our manufacturing jobs to China. We should get rid of all of our retail and have our goods delivered by drones by Amazon.
That's going to happen.
Look, part of the purpose of antitrust is to create a diverse, variegated economy that has corporations that operate at different levels. Again, the principle of subsidiarity. It's one of the disappointing things about the recovery since 2008 has been the lack of new business formation, and it's hard to know why that's the case. It could be a cultural thing that the kind of people that used to form small companies are addicted to heroin, and so they're not actually starting their own welding company. So we don't know why that's the case, but it's not a happy outcome. And I would submit that the kind of democratic capitalism that Michael Novak cared about, and I care about too, it requires an economy that isn't concentrated in mega corporations, but rather has people who can engage in business leadership at many different levels and do so in a way that's connected with communities and with people, and not operating from afar. So I think that we have an interest in antitrust that involves more than efficiency, and I think that's one thing that actually moral thinkers and Christians can add to that way of thinking about our economic regulation. It's not just about wealth creation and efficiency. Creating opportunity and a chance for people to participate in our economy in many different ways.
All right, let's take one from the back, all the way in the back here. There's one. Please rise.
So this is for you, Dr. Reno. When you talk about contemporary free markets, it seems, at least for a digital native like myself, that the big sort of gaping hole that you haven't addressed yet, at least directly, is the rise of digital technology and digital automation. So my question is this: when we think about the future of free markets, how do we deal with the fact that digital technology and the automation that's accompanying it seems to make the average citizen's most significant contribution to free markets, which is their labor, increasingly less valuable?
I guess I'm an optimist on this score. I mean, this has been a line that people have been promoting since automation, since the assembly line at Henry Ford's factory. But in fact, it's not been the case. That automation increases productivity, but it also winds up increasing employment. And so it increases the wealth for society as a whole, and that it doesn't have a negative impact on employment. We're currently at very low employment, so I'm not. It's not something I worry about deeply. I do think we have a collective responsibility to, because we're all in this together, that those who are displaced by technological advance need to have support from civic organizations, but also from the government, because one reason we band together as a society is to function as a bit of an insurance policy for each other. But I'm not in the long term worried about that.
Father, do you want to say anything to that?
I'm just delighted to hear you say that, because I was waiting for "it scares the horses." That was what they said when the
buggy whip
automobiles,
makers,
the buggy, they were going to be all out of job. No, I think this enhances human creativity and is going to, in the end, so amen.
All right, we have a gentleman standing up back there.
Very urgent.
Yes, who really looks like he wants to ask a question.
Thank you, Professor Thornbury. So my question is for Father Sirico. Could you name one time in the history of capitalism in which an army of free, small entrepreneurs reversed the trend line in the spread of pornography away from becoming diffused throughout the entire society of Western civilization? Just one time.
I mean, I don't even know how to begin to address that, because there's so many levels of it. I mean, in the whole history of world capitalism, how entrepreneurs could reverse, is that what you're saying? How they would reverse? Because I mean, pornography, the
Let's limit it to the 20th
the acute
century.
nature
And I'll just ask
of
you,
the
said that a
pornography-
free society would totally roll back the effects of pornography upon Western civilization.
Excuse me, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I said it gives us the potential to do that we can do that we have had moral changes of whole societies. Now, you're going into pornography, which the nature of this particular dilemma is precisely technological, and I think we need to respond to it, which would also include technology, and there are a number of groups that are working on this right now. I think the question is kind of got you. Have I stopped beating my wife yet? Of course, people who are free. I don't have a wife.
Duh.
And I don't beat my dog either.
Okay, let's see here. Joe.
Thank you. My question goes to both respondents. Could you name one or two examples of a civic institution, not government, that you point to or hold up as an exemplar of your point of view that we should learn about and find ways to support or to encourage that you think would advance and make better contributions for your respective points of view?
I mentioned the tuition tax credit scheme that was first, I think, in Arizona, and that's led to the development of that subsidiarity at its best, because what it's doing is that, as the principle of subsidiarity is, it's the responsibility of the higher authority both to not to assume responsibility of those at a lower level, but it's also the responsibility to empower those at a lower level to fully discharge their duties and responsibilities. And I think we have a duty to try to reform our educational system, which is a mess. I mean, one of the reasons that I oppose H-1B visas, in fact, I would like to eliminate H-1B visas altogether. This is a safety valve for corporate America not to fix our educational system. We'll just import the talented, well-educated people to work in the United States. And we'll just leave the vast majority of Americans with this crappy school system that doesn't educate anyone. How are we going to fix this? We have to empower local groups to take those steps. And one of them, and it's a good example, there are no government bureaucrats. This is a tax credit scheme that does require perhaps actuarial people at the IRS or at the state level tax collection agency. So I think that's a very important example of what I...
Yeah, you
These are
asked about
institutions. I mean, they're actual existing people that have scholarship funds. They have boards of directors. They have, I mean, what do you want?
I'm looking for understanding the kind of institution you recommend
I was trying to give one that supports my position. And my position is that the principle of subsidiarity urges us to use the higher power in order to create the conditions under which the lower power can become more active and engaged in civic life. That's why I'm also in favor of taxing supersized endowments. We have this cultural monopoly of educational policy among sort of super elite, fancy pants universities, Ivy League
Amen.
fancy pants universities, and you could be you're on the board of trustees of King's College, and all the trustees are saying, well, aren't we doing best practices and blah 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 blah, and it turns out best practices are what the fancy pants universities are doing. So part of what subsidiarity is, well, you got to break down the inordinate authority of these very large institutions that are sucking educational leadership away from the local level and into these. They're not governmental institutions, but they're part of the same network of the oligarchic elite. And I think so.
These are lock, stock, and barrel governmental institutions because they're supported by the government. You remove the subsidies that they get, and then they're competing with King's College.
I'll do that
and
too.
That's what. Well, why don't you do that first? But the whole thing is now we're going to have this policy, we're going to have that policy. Let just parents send their kids to the schools they want, and let the money flow with the kids. Just rather than building these mechanisms that can be manipulated, because you set these mechanisms in place. It's kind of like the Office for faith-based charities. You set these things in place, and then you have Hillary Clinton running them, or you have somebody.
No,
what
I agree.
we need to do is more freedom, clear the decks rather than pile more regulations on it. You want an institution? I'll give you two examples. On a micro level, my parish. You come and see my school, no money from the government in any way. We, in principle, don't take any of it. And the kind of culture that's in that parish when somebody is ill, when a woman has a child, they have this, I forget what it's called, where everybody brings food to the home for 2 or 3 weeks. It's an incredibly, I didn't even do anything about that. The other thing on a larger scale, and I think the reason for it, the doctrinal differences aside, the Mormon Church has a great philanthropical charitable system, that there's no Mormon who's in good standing with the Mormon Church who goes without, because they have to work for it. They have bishops' warehouses where they can go shopping. They have money if they need it, and they have employment networks. The reason they can do that is that they have a common vision. They have a clear mission. I know there's a lot of monoculturalism there too, that it makes it more difficult for something like the Catholic Church, which is here comes everybody, to do that. But I think if we had that kind of joint mission, and we can do that in Grand Rapids. The philanthropic community, they don't just give money. They challenge people to compete for the charitable money that's there. And one goes to another and says, I'm giving this money, will you join me in doing this? And it's created this whole culture. That's what I'm saying. We got to return to really building institutions and not thinking we create institutions just by coming up with policies.
All right, let's take one more from this side. Tall hand here in the back.
So it's sort of a two-part question. The first part is for Dr. Reno. In normal life, so in criminal law, we would all, I think, say that prior constraint is an unacceptable way of administering justice. So if I wouldn't be arrested for potentially committing a murder. So I'm wondering if you can provide justification. Why in the economic sphere, then, do we so readily accept prior restraint? Which is what I take regulation to be, which is that because you may do something, we'll constrain your behavior. So that's the first part. The second part is unrelated, which is, if for both of you,
I'm a little baffled here. So if you say murder is a crime, aren't you exercising prior restraint on my freedom to murder people?
If you put me in prison because I could murder someone.
Well, right, but if I say that there's a financial regulation that says if you do X, you get fined Y, you only get fined Y if you do X.
Yeah, but what gives you the right to say I can't do X before I, like, so I guess the point being, yeah, sorry. why is it that you can constrain behavior because you? I guess.
Parking laws constrain behavior. You're only allowed to park, after 7 o'clock, and if you park after 7, you get a ticket. We have all kinds of financial regulations that if you provide a 401k to your executives, you also have to provide it to all of your employees, so that's a prior constraint on your freedom to just offer it to your executives. Just like you can't park until 8 is a prior restraint on your parking before 8. And there's a penalty associated with violating that regulation. I don't see the analogy to criminal law seems actually straightforward and correct rather than contrary.
Okay, I think that we are at getting close to the bell, and we're going to enter in now to 5 minutes of summary reflections here. We can just do this from our seats. I'll ask Rusty to go first, and Father Sirico, if you would close us out.
Yeah. Pulling it all together, difficult to do, no doubt. When I wrote about Michael Novak, I was very aware, because I shared many of his views. I still share many of his views. But obviously, I have a different sense of urgency than he had writing in 1982. And I think the reality of the Cold War, the clear and present danger of communism, focused us on certain problems, and appropriately so. But 1989 changed a lot more than I realized at the time. And since 1989, our country has taken the lead in promoting a global system of free trade and more open financial markets. That's been our policy as Americans. We undertook this for political reasons. We believe that this would expand the circle of prosperity and raise developing countries out of poverty, and I think that was probably borne out. We also thought it would plant the seeds of liberal democracy. That hope, I think, has not been realized, or at least not as much as we had hoped. And it was that we would promote international cooperation through commerce. Now, I don't really think I want to debate debate the pros and cons of those goals and so on and so forth. Instead, I just want to come back to what I've been saying tonight, which is that this system that we have created since 1989. I don't care what we call it: managerial capitalism, crony capitalism, capitalism full stop, global capitalism. The system that we created is entering into crisis. We are entering into a crisis. And unlike the 1930s, this is a crisis that's first political and not economic. The system works pretty well. I mean, you go out in the streets of New York, we're a rich country and we're getting richer. The problem is the political support for that global system is evaporating in the democratic societies of the West, Europe and the United States. And we need to address that crisis, that lack of political, that decline, that evaporation of political support, if we want to save this system. So I'm here to tell you that socialism is dead, and it will not be resurrected. And it's a waste of our precious intellectual energy to defend against that possibility. And instead, we need to turn our attention to figuring out how to save the global capitalist system that we have created. We need to save global capitalism from its own excesses. We need to figure out how we can maintain national solidarity and the link between the leadership and the led, between what Peggy Noonan calls the protected and everyone else. This is difficult in an economic system that tells us that a corporate manager's primary and really exclusive duty is to shareholders and not to any particular political entity. It's going to be hard to do that given our current understanding of what the duties and responsibilities of corporate leaders are. Because shareholder value, maximizing shareholder value, speaks strongly in favor of offshoring, importing creative talent, offshoring production, and relocating to low-tax countries. I mean, a corporate manager who thinks that's his primary duty is doing his duty. And so we need to think long and hard about what are the duties of corporate leaders, what corporations should be held accountable to in a free economy. We need to ask how we can prevent the rise of a global oligarchy that threatens to deprive us of our political agency. As I said, I think we should not underestimate the desire of this political oligarchy, which governs the global economic system that we've created. We shouldn't underestimate their desire for world government. It's much more efficient for them to deal with a global entity. Right now, international corporations typically resolve their commercial disputes through international arbitration. So there's an international legal system which is independent of any sovereign nation. That, I'm not opposed to it. I think it makes sense, but it's an indication of what large global corporations want. They don't want the inefficiencies and friction of national sovereignty. And the third thing we need to ask ourselves is how can we preserve the ideals of a free economy in a system that is very good at masking its corruptions with the rhetoric of free markets. That's one of the biggest challenges we face. The corruptions of this system are masked and justified by free market ideology. Bret Stephens and Tom Friedman are high priests of this global oligarchy. So it seems to me that global capitalism is not something we need to defend. It is something we need to save. And the circumstances are the reverse of the 1930s. And the economic crisis then precipitated a political crisis, and now we have a political crisis that may precipitate an economic crisis as these populist rebellions try to smash global capitalism in an attempt to go back to socialism or some other absurd and failed economic model, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. So my point is this: free markets are here to stay, it seems to me. And what we need is a new deal for global capitalism. What I've been arguing for tonight is a violation of strict free market principles for the sake of saving our global free market system. And this will mean sometimes lowering some taxes, but also raising others, eliminating regulations in some place, but also increasing regulations in others. There's all kinds of differentiated policies we need to have. We need to motivate ourselves to think this through. And in all of this, we're going to need, it seems to me, sound political judgment. This is going to be more difficult, I think, than most of us imagine, the coming challenge of saving this system. Modernity has been an age of ideologies, and these ideologies promise justice without virtue. Communism is a classic example. If we get rid of private property, we won't need government. A certain kind of libertarian thinking is equally utopian. If we get rid of regulations on the free economy, we'll become a self-organizing society. Utilitarianism is also a modern utopian dream of justice without virtue. All our leadership needs is a calculator and not political wisdom. So it's incumbent upon us, I believe, to try to develop political wisdom so that we can exercise a fitting leadership in this time of crisis and restore confidence in that the global capitalist system, which I think we should support, actually serves the interest of all the citizens of our countries in the West.
You and I and every person who exists was made in the image and likeness of Almighty God. Every person who exists, from the moment of our conception until our natural death. And in the creation of the world, we were placed in a particular circumstance. I suppose that God in his wisdom could have placed us in any number of circumstances, but he placed us in this circumstance, which is to say that the heavens and the earth that he created and formed and pronounced good, he formed from the dust of the ground the human person, who is a combination of both the physical and the breath of life, the transcendent. And we are placed in the context of this material world and its scarcity, which gives rise to markets, which gives rise to the necessity of work. This world that God created and is good because it emanated from him, and we are called to be co-creators with him in this world. This is the anthropological base of everything else we're talking about, and everything else we talk about needs to be measured against that. So when we touch questions of human work, we are touching the image of God in human beings. In order for us to actuate and make this vocation that we have been given real, God endowed us with freedom, with free will, with reason, which requires freedom, because it's our reason that is the dominant element whereby we relate to the material world in ways that are different than animals. Animals relate to the material world based on instinct. We relate to the material world based on reason, and that's why freedom is so important, because we can't operate, we can't use this wonderful endowment that is so akin to God himself, reason, in order to draw out from the material world the things that we need to survive. The context of scarcity is what gives rise to economics. It's the proper and prudent use of scarce resources. And our creativity in drawing this out, this process that we call work that comes to be called a market, is, in the words of a gentleman who is from Grand Rapids, he happened to be the librarian at Calvin College. He said, work is the form in which we make ourselves useful to others. It's work whereby we emulate the action of God who created the material world. So if this is the way in which the lens through which we see the world, then we have to apply those same principles of prudence and human dignity to that world. Not to make it so abstract, much less so political, that we lose sight of the human action that is involved in assessing the needs that a person has and the gifts and the talents that a person has and expressing that value in markets. That's what it is. This is a tool. It's a way in which we go about serving others. And like all other tools, like human freedom itself, it can be abused. But the abuse of a thing, we remember, in the great Thomistic principle, does not mean that it does not have its use. Perhaps the greatest disagreement, the most urgent disagreement that Rusty and I have tonight is that I do see a threat to human freedom. Whether you call it socialism or collectivism or managerial capitalism, which is another form of collectivism, where people restrict access to the work and the gifts of others, that's what we're talking about here. These are threats. Socialism itself is a threat. 45% of the millennials identify with socialism, and an alarming number of them, I think about half of them, 1 in 5 Americans in their 20s considered Joseph Stalin, and get this, Lenin and Kim Jong-un, heroes. That's the reality that we're facing. I think the movement that is represented by the trend that we see recently in First Things and the people coming around that, rallying around that, indicates the urgency. See, I don't think freedom, I don't think liberty is as durable as Rusty seems to think it is. I think it is, as Lord Acton said, the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. It's not anchored in the politics and the society that Richard Neuhaus lived in his moment, or that Novak lived in his moment, because both of those men drew from an anthropology. They drew from a more ancient vision of who human beings are as image bearers of Almighty God, and attempted to construct an idea and an application in their time, in their place, because that's the only way in which you can do it. You can't construct or mount a criticism of your society or your culture from outside of your culture. You have to do it within it. Of course they did it there. Now we have new challenges, particularly with the internet and all of the digital reality that we're confronting. We have to mount that new challenge, but we don't do it by abandoning our anthropology. We don't do it by abandoning freedom, because freedom needs to be won successively in each generation. It is delicate, and it is under attack because of original sin, where people want to dominate the lives of other people. And that threat comes to us in a multiplicity of ways, and predominantly through coercive means, manipulative means that people will employ as the result of the scar on the image that God placed on them. So no, I think we have a real problem related to freedom and its proper use. A renewed understanding is required of the telos of human liberty, which is the truth, and the truth of who human beings are in their full dignity. And of course we see that in the person of Jesus Christ, who teaches us who we are. No, I think what is needed tonight is that First Things needs to get back to first things. Thank you.
Will you please join me in thanking Rusty, Father?